everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to use Affinity Designer to create textured vintage style Polaroid elements like these that can be used with one of the built-in Canva frames. When it's complete, you'll have a fun textured frame complete with drop shadows and highlights that you can easily pop your favorite photos into in Canva. Now I'm using Designer in Canva for desktop, but if you're on the iPad version of either, as long as you know where the tools are located, you should be able to follow along. The tutorial is a bit on the longer side, so I've added chapters in the description below so that you can easily refer back to sections when needed. Let's get started. I'm going to work on a 3000 by 3000 pixel canvas set to 300 dpi. I'm going to be using textures, and in case there's a need to print something using one of these frames, I want to avoid pixelation when creating my Canva frame, so I'm going to start at a print-ready DPI of 300. Ultimately, I'm going to be exporting a transparent canvas, but since I'll be exporting as a PDF and the default for PDF is transparent, I don't need to worry about setting the transparent background here. I'm just going to let Designer create the default white background. Before we begin creating the Polaroid frame, I just want to show you two that I've already created. So these are made up of 3 layers, and this is ultimately what I export. There's a Polaroid top, which is the part that's cut out. There's a placeholder that allows me to have something to snap to when I add the frame later in Canva. And then there's a back that allows me to add drop shadows. These 2 layers are rasterized once I create them, because that's how Canva needs to read the shadows and texture. And we'll talk all about that once we're done creating the Polaroid frame. I'm going to build my Polaroid frame using rectangles and both the geometric operations in the contextual menu as well as the contour tool. I'm going to start with my largest shape. I have this off-white color selected and the rectangle tool, and I'll just drag out a tall rectangle. I'm just going to eyeball it. All right, I like how that looks. I'm going to click out to deselect it and change the color. I want to use the rectangle tool again, and this time I'm going to hover at the very corner of the shape I just created and hold shift down to drag out a perfect square. Now I could use my move tool with command and shift to scale in from the center, but I actually prefer to use the contour tool for something like this. So I can either click O on my keyboard or click it here in the toolbar, and I'll just click and drag to the left. And it's going to scale it down from the center, so it's offsetting my original rectangle. And I'll bring it to about there. Now, one final step that you always want to take when using the contour tool is to bake the appearance. This is going to set the corners so that if you continue to scale this up and down, the contour doesn't continue to shift. So I'll go ahead and do that. And now I have 4 set nodes. Now I want to use this to punch out the hole in the top of the Polaroid frame, but before I do that, I want to make copies of both of these shapes. I mentioned earlier that there's going to be an image placeholder, and if I use this shape to subtract from this one, it's going to disappear. So before I use it, I'm going to Command J to duplicate it, and I'll just name this one image placeholder. I also want to duplicate the larger shape because, again, I need a background that I'll add my drop shadow to, and I'll explain all of that when we get to adding the dimension. So I'm just going to Command J to duplicate that one, and I'll name this one back of Polaroid. This one I can name top of Polaroid. It's a good idea to maintain your layers and make sure that you name them. And now I want to select this one and command click and select this. It's really important that the smaller shape is on the top. That's what we're going to use to subtract. I'll go up to the top here to the contextual menu and click on subtract. And that's going to punch that shape out of the middle. If I turn these 2 off, you can see that's empty. So I actually want this to be at the very top. I'll just drag that up. And now I'm all set with all of my shapes, and I can begin adding my texture. Before I begin adding my texture, since I'm working on such a light shape here, I'm going to drag out just a yellow rectangle here. You don't need to do this. This is just so that you can see what I'm doing more easily. I'm going to delete this before I export anything. So I'll just lock that into place so I don't accidentally move it around. And now I'm going to select the top of my Polaroid. I want to give this a really old feel, like it was found in an old shoebox somewhere in a basement and maybe got wet. You can make yours as textural as you want. You can keep it clean or you can make it more texture than I do. Texture is a personal choice, so just play around with different ones and different settings until you get the style that you want. So I'm going to use a combination of textures from the Stock Studio as well as Texture Labs, and I'll link that in the description below. I'm going to start with the textures from the Stock Studio. So I pulled up this texture on Pixabay. I just used the keywords coffee stain. I just want to drag this in, and it's a relatively small file. I'm just going to bring it up here, and I think I like this area the best. I'm just going to bring that around here, and I want to clip this inside of the top of the Polaroid shape. Now, obviously, I don't want to leave it like this. I need to make some changes to this. So I'm going to use a combination of blend modes, blend options, and opacity shifts. So I'm going to start out with blend options. With the texture layer selected, I'll go to the cog up here at the top, and that's going to bring up these two graphs. And I want to focus specifically on this left one. Now, if you're on the iPad version of the app, you can find this under the ellipsis in the layers panel. So I want to focus on source layer ranges because that's what I want to change, the source layer. The left side is going to remove any dark areas. The right side is going to remove any light areas, and that's what I want to do here. So I'm going to click and drag this down until I have everything but those coffee stains left. And I might even drag this over to the left a little bit. This is a non-destructive change. If I find I need to adjust it all, I can do that. Now, before I continue, one thing I didn't do yet is rasterize and trim this. You can see I have a lot hanging out over the edge of the artboard, and that's unnecessary. It just gives you a larger file. So before I move on, I'm going to right-click, rasterize and trim, and that's going to bring that in. Now, it didn't do it on this side. Don't worry about that. I'm just going to grab my crop tool, drag that in, and I can just rasterize it again. All right, so now that we have the blend option shift, I'm going to change my blend mode to linear burn and just bring this down. I don't want this to be too obvious. I just want it to give it a little bit of a sort of a stained look, like there's a bit of a water stain. All right, while I'm working with the Stock Studio, I'm going to select that layer again. I want to this time find a craft paper texture. And I like a particular one that's in the Pexels category by Resource Boy. It's this one right here. I'll just click and drag that in. It's going to pull it in really large. What I like about these are these little bits here, these little dark areas, but these are much too large. So what I'll do is just back out a little bit. I'm going to go to my transform panel and I want to click in the middle here. That's going to set the anchor point to the middle of the object, and I'll just click and drag down. And just keep dragging until it's just a little bit bigger than this shape. All right. Again, I'll right click, rasterize and trim. And then I'll go back in and clip this inside of my shape. Now I need to make some changes to this because obviously I don't want this to be brown. So what I'm going to do is once again, go to my blend options and I'm going to start by dragging down. On the right side, I want to pull all the lighter areas in because remember, I want to keep those little bits. And I'll just drag to the left a little bit. And then one final texture that I want to bring in is a halftone grunge texture from Texture Labs. If you've ever looked at an old Polaroid, sometimes you'll see these little dots on it, and it's usually because they got stuck together and the back of another Polaroid created a little bit of an imprint. So I'm going to sort of mimic that as best as I can. So with this shape selected, I'm going to go up to the top here and choose Insert Inside Selection. That's automatically going to clip my texture inside of this layer. So I'll use the place tool and I'm going to grab this texture right here. I'll drag out, and because I chose that at the top, you can see it's automatically clipped it inside. I'll move it where I want, so right about there. And then once again, I'm just going to rasterize and trim. And I'm going to drag this beneath the paper layer and set this to, I think, overlay. But I'm also going to go into the blend options and pull all of the white out of it. So again, all I have left are those little spots. I don't want this to be obvious. I just want it in certain areas. So let's go ahead and start adding some shadows and highlights to give this some dimension. So I want to keep this pretty subtle because ultimately a Polaroid is pretty flat. But I want to create some highlights and shadows around the edges of my shape, including the inside area here. If you've ever seen an old Polaroid, the spot where the image develops is slightly indented. So I want to mimic that by adding some highlights and shadows using a 3D effect from the FX Studio. So again, I'll select this top layer. I'm going to select FX from the bottom, and let me just move this over here. And I want to click to turn on the 3D effect. And I just want to make sure the contextual menu is up. Just click next to it, and that's the contextual menu for 3D. Again, I want to keep this relatively flat. Let's just click out of here just to check where it's at right now. I actually quite like this. I think it's pretty much where I want it to be. Again, I'm just looking to add some very, very subtle shadows and highlights. Let me click back in here. The one thing I do want to do though is change the direction of this. I plan to make my drop shadows on this particular frame down and to the right, which means that all of my shadows on the shape need to follow. So right now, these shadows are on the left side of this, which means they need to be on the other side if my drop shadow is going to be down and to the right. So I'll select this, and what I want to do is go down to azimuth. That's going to change the direction of the light, and I'll just drag this to the right until I get to about 130 degrees. Now if I click out of there, you can see my highlights are now on this side. My shadows are here on the right. Now if I wanted to, I could play around with the softening a little bit just to see what it looks like. It's just going to soften up some of those lines. In fact, I think I might do that. I like that a little bit better. It's not a lot. Again, this whole effect is pretty subtle. I really just want to bring it up to about 5 pixels for the radius, and it's about 1.5 to 2 pixels for the softening. You don't want this to look rounded. You want it to maintain a flat look. That's the only effect I'm going to add to this. I don't want to add a drop shadow to this shape. And the reason for that is if I were to do that, if I click in here and then bring up the contextual menu for this, if I drag out the offset, not only am I getting a drop shadow here, but I'm getting one here, and I don't want that. So what I'm going to do is add it to the back of the Polaroid only. That way you don't see any of this here. So let me turn that off and close this, and I'll go ahead and select the back of the Polaroid. Okay, once again, I want to select the layer, and I'll go to my FX Studio. I'll click to turn on the outer shadow and just make sure I have the contextual menu up. Now, you really want to think ahead as to what it would look like in real life. A Polaroid is thicker than a regular photograph, but it's not so thick that it should have a really, really deep shadow. But I want it to be enough that you can see it. So I'm going to bring my offset up. And again, I want it to come down to the right. So I want to make sure my angle is going this way. And I think I'll bring it up to about 30 pixels. And then I'm going to bring the radius up higher than that. This is non-destructive until I rasterize this. So again, I can always change this if I want to, but I think I like how that looks. I think I might bring the radius up to maybe about 45. All right. Now the thing about looking at something head on like this is you wouldn't just have a drop shadow going down and to the right. You'd have a very slight shadow here too, because this part is raised as well. So I'm going to select that again. Click on my FX Studio. Designer makes it really easy to add a second shadow, and this is why I add the shadow here rather than leaving this flat and adding it in Canva. I could certainly do that, and Canva does have a drop shadow feature, but I don't have as much control over it, especially in the fact that I can't add a second drop shadow. So I'm just going to click on this plus here. Now I need this to be up and to the left, so I'm going to change the angle just by clicking and dragging. So it's 135. And I want to bring the offset in. All right, so right about there, maybe there. And I'll just bring the radius up. Again, it's very, very subtle. Right about maybe there. At this point, my texture and dimension are in place, and I'm ready to begin prepping my layers for export so that I can load them into Canva. Canva treats vectors as flat. You can't add shadows or texture to them. So in order to maintain the shadows and texture I've added here, I need to rasterize these layers. The thing about rasterization is that it's a destructive edit. So if you're not sure if you're going to want to make changes, I recommend doing this next step on a copy. So I'm going to right click on Polaroid frame 3 here, and I'll go ahead and duplicate. And with my move tool, I'll just move this over. And that's already taken care of removing that rectangle because it wasn't actually in the artboard. So I'm going to leave this one as it is in case I need to come back and make any changes to the shapes or the colors or anything like that. And I'll move over to this one. And what I need to do is first, I'm going to change the name of it to Polaroid Frame 4 because I'm only going to export this frame. So keeping it named is going to allow me to more easily do that. I'll open this up and I can leave the image placeholder alone. That can remain a vector. It's not a problem. Again, this is just an image placeholder that's going to allow me to snap the frame into place. What I need to do though is export this top layer. So I'll select the whole group, right click, and I'm going to choose rasterize. It's going to ask me if I want to preserve the layer effects. In other words, do I want to keep this non-destructive? And I don't. I actually want to lock those in. So I'm going to remove that and click rasterize. I'll do the same thing with this back layer. I'm going to click on it, right click, turn this off, and hit rasterize. And now all of the drop shadows and all of the highlights have remained in place. And at this point, I'm ready to export this to load it into Canva. I need to export this so that I can maintain my layers in a format that's readable by Canva. So I'm going to export this as a PDF. It's really important that you do this. So I'm going to select this artboard. I'll go up to the top, choose File, and Export. The first thing I want to do is make sure that my area says Polaroid Frame 4, and this is why it's important to name that. I also want to make sure that my format at the top up here is PDF. And those are the only two things I'm going to change. I'm going to make sure that digital high quality is selected because, again, I have textures and I want to make sure that my DPI stays 300. And I'll go ahead and hit Export and save it to a file. With my file exported as a PDF, I'm ready to head into Canva, import that PDF, and add the built-in frame to it. I'm here in Canva, and these are 2 Polaroid frames that I created previously, and these are just the PDFs that I built in Designer with one of the built-in square frames that I pulled from Elements sitting on top. And this is where the image placeholder comes in handy. If this wasn't here, for me to snap this into place, it really wouldn't work. I'd have to do a lot of eyeballing. And the thing that you run the risk of doing is overlapping the highlights and the shadows on that inner part. So that's why I like to keep that in place. I just keep that there so if this frame ever gets deleted, I can very easily replace it again just by pulling from Elements. So I want to go ahead and bring in the PDF that I just exported, and I'm going to do it right here in this document. I've named this Polaroid frames so that anytime I can just open this up, select which one I want to use, and pull it into another document like this one. So I've added a third page. If you want to do yours separately, you can certainly do that. It's totally up to you how you organize things. Just go to your home screen and upload it from there, and it'll create separate files. So I'm going to go to my uploads and choose upload file. I'll find the frame that I just exported. It's not going to upload it here. It's going to bring it into my project files. And as soon as it's in place, I can just pop it into that page simply by clicking on it. And I'm all set to start adding my frame. Now, if I go to the layers on this one, you can see I have my Polaroid top, the image placeholder, and the Polaroid bottom. And the top and the bottom have all of the texture and all the dimension that I added in Designer because, again, I rasterized them and saved this as a PDF. So now my last step here is just to pull the frame in. So I'll go to Elements, and you can find it here at the bottom. It's the very first one. Now it's much smaller than my shape, but again, because I have that image placeholder in there, it's very easy to correct that. So I'm just going to drag this up until it snaps to the corner. And then I'll just drag this one down, snap it into place, and my frame is all set. So I'll go to my uploads and just test this out by pulling in some of my images. And if I want to bring this back to its original state, I could do that simply by clicking on this trash can and choosing delete image. Now, one last thing I want to do is click and drag to select all of my layers, and I'm going to group this. That's going to allow me to more easily select it. Command C to copy it, or I could right click and I can very easily bring it into another design where I can size it up and down or move it around. And again, I can just go right in and start adding some of my images. And that's it. That's how easy it is to create your own Polaroid frames starting in Designer and then importing them to complete them in Canva. If you have any questions or suggestions for a tutorial you'd like to see here on my YouTube channel, let me know in the comments below. And if you like my teaching style, I've linked both my Skillshare channel as well as my own learning site, The Creator Collage, where you can find all of my full-length classes. Now I have lots more tutorials coming to my channel here, but in the meantime, you might want to check out one of these two next. Thanks for watching.